Yeah, I think figuring out that one thing, that you can, that's your competitive advantage. Is that, do you have a lot of the companies that you work with, do you try to focus in on that moat that a lot of VCs refer to, as you're working with companies and figuring out, okay, what's this one thing that you guys can do differently that's your competitive advantage that's going to be really, really difficult for others to, copy or to also do? Is that something that you try to look for most of the companies that you invest in?
Yeah, and look, I mean, if you go back to this Yelp example, like they didn't have a competitive advantage. They weren't able to do something that no one else could do. There were literally 5 better capitalized consumer review sites at the time, including CitySearch, which was a very large business back then. And so they didn't have a competitive advantage. They had an insight. And there's a difference between a competitive advantage and insight. And eventually, all your competitors will understand your insight. But if you can exploit the heck out of it for a long enough period of time, you can do some serious damage and maybe put them out of business, which is essentially what Yelp was able to do. And so to me, I, as an investor, I think one of my skills is I can identify when someone else shares an insight, but there's no way I'm going to help them figure out what the insight is. To figure out what an insight is, you got to spend hours and hours and hours going super deep into a very specific domain, and it sort of hits you in the shower, on the toilet, while you're waking up or dreaming at night. I sort of feel like that's where those insights come from. It's like that eureka moment, perhaps. But it doesn't come because you got lucky and had a eureka moment. It comes because you've been studying a specific thing so deeply that you suddenly realize a connection that other people aren't observing. That's what I'm looking for when I hear an entrepreneur story. Not why they're necessarily going to do it better than everybody else, but what is their guiding principle? What is the insight that they're operating on that other people either don't understand or are simply overlooking altogether? And that's not a permanent advantage. That's not a moat, but it's what you need as a startup to get started. Because in general, like, startups don't have moats. Startups have nothing. They got to gradually through blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah, they got a little stream. Yeah. So, okay, we have another question here from Patty, who said, "Do you ever scout for startups, or how do you? I guess, do you only accept cold emails? I'm sure you have warm intros and a big network that Bessemer gets, just through their existing network. What's the best way to, for a startup to approach you? Cold email, or do you actually, go out, and where do you look to find the new best startups that you're trying to find? Do you go to events? Do you go to pitch competitions, universities? How do you think about finding and sourcing deals for the future?
We touched on this a little bit earlier. I'm not a networker. That's not my thing. I mean, I do some of it, but it's not my favorite activity. There are other people at Bessemer who are phenomenal at it, and they'll do a lot of that. And so to get in front of Bessemer, pitch events and networking events, all that is effective. It's not necessarily the most efficient way of getting to me, because I'm not typically attending a lot of those things. But sometimes one of my colleagues will be attending one, and they'll hear about a company that's in an area that I've expressed internally an interest in, or is on one of my roadmaps, so to speak, and that's how I'll find out about it. But like I said, I often, as I think about an area and where I want to invest, I will then go find every company in that area, or I'll work with a colleague to go find every company in that area, and then proactively reach out to those companies and say, here's what I think what you're doing is interesting. Can we meet and talk about it? And so, that's how we invested in Yelp. That's how we invested in LinkedIn. That's how we invested in Pinterest. And so that's often the way we do it. So, I mean, if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to find your way to me personally, go work on something that I think is interesting, but that's crazy. You shouldn't work on something I think is interesting. You should work on what you think is interesting. And if it happens to overlap, I will probably find you. But yeah, I do get lots of cold emails. Like I said, I don't reply to them all. It's impossible. I used to. Now I feel like kind of a jerk, but it's just practically impossible. I'd have to literally spend all day, every day, just replying to emails, which I can't do. And even then, I'm not trying to get through it. Warm intros are great because I do have a lot of trusted relationships within the entrepreneurial community and the VC community. And if one of those people sends me an introduction, I feel an obligation not only to reply, but also spend some time with that entrepreneur. And so that's almost a guarantee of a meeting But I feel like those people who know me well enough to make those intros are pretty critical and not likely to just make an intro for the sake of doing it. But mostly, like, no one's objective should be to meet with me or have me invest in the company. Their objective should be to build a company that they're really excited about and proud of, and someone will invest in it, if not me, because it doesn't happen to fall in an area that I'm focused on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. What we have another question here before we wrap up. What are some materials, resources, books, podcasts, courses? What do you recommend your founders that you work with and invest in get educated or continue learning? Are there any people that you recommend they listen to? Any videos that you recommend they watch? Any books that you recommend they read?
I mean, I'm a fan of general business literature. I don't know what to call it. Business books. I like nonfiction business stories, and there are a few that I've often urged CEOs and founders in my portfolio to read. A few of my favorites are The Outsiders, which is a book about, I think it's 8 or 10 highly unconventional public company CEOs who act and think differently, and really think a lot about capital allocation. In fact, I recommend it to Toby Shopify. He hated the book.
What was that title?
It's called The Outsiders.
Oh, Outsiders.
Yeah.
Toby from Shopify hated it.
and he told me to read Teams of Teams, which I read. He thought that was much more relevant to what he was doing. I'm a huge fan of Cable Cowboy, the John Malone story. I like Shoe Dog, the Phil Knight Nike story. I like those. I think they're inspirational to find out about some of the challenges, particularly early on, those entrepreneurs went through. But also, I think there's some interesting business strategy lessons embedded in a lot of those books. Mostly, though, I think the best advice is when you have a specific problem, finding the people who either went through that problem or you think could give you advice on that problem. And I think what's surprising is that folks who've already been through it and have been successful are often remarkably willing to share their time to help you through that same problem. But if you were to approach those same people who are often really successful and ask some sort of lame, generic question, they're not going to give you the time of day. But if you can explain why you think your problem is really similar to one that they faced and it resonates with them, there's a huge culture of giving back within the entrepreneurial community that carries you all the way to really successful CEOs. And so I'd say trying to learn generic stuff isn't necessarily all that helpful, but when you have a specific problem, you could probably find someone who can help you through it.